Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation, with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott. For our pilot skills topic today, we'll talk about an MIT study that shows how pilots behave around thunderstorms. And later, we'll talk with Seth Lake about something that all pilots need to know about, and that's military training routes, or MTRs, and I bet you'll learn something new about them. And finally, we'll talk with two newsmakers who piloted the second GA flight to deliver COVID vaccine. Last week in episode 173, we talked about IFR departure procedures and ODPs. We also interviewed Robert Rose about remotely piloted aircraft that are flying at Reliable Robotics, and Rob Mark joined us to talk about the importance of a sterile cockpit, particularly when you're taking off and landing. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out. And I want to call your attention to the share button in the app that you're currently using to listen to us. For example, if you're using the Apple Podcast app, if you tap on the three dots at the bottom of your screen, the share button is at the top of the list that comes up. I'd like to ask you to use that button today and share Aviation News Talk with a friend who you think might enjoy it. So please support the show by sharing it with a friend. This week in the news, there will be many flying restrictions around Washington, D.C. this week. Used aircraft sales spiked upward at the end of last year, and a Pilatus PC-12 pilot is in big trouble in Britain. All this and more, and the news starts now. From avweb.com, a report calls for a multi-pathway approach to mitigating aviation lead. A new report published by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine Transportation Research Board says multiple mitigation strategies are necessary to reduce lead emissions from piston aircraft. The study, Options for Reducing Lead Emissions from Piston Engine Aircraft, was conducted by a committee in response to a congressional request laid out in the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2018. The committee's stated goals were to assess existing non-leaded fuel alternatives to aviation gasoline, ambient lead concentrations at and around GA airports, and mitigation measures to reduce those ambient lead concentrations. Noting that lead exposure can result in an array of negative health effects in humans, the committee's recommendations for near-term mitigation efforts included having the FAA establish a partnership with GA organizations to create an ongoing education, training, and awareness campaign on avgas lead exposure. In addition, it asked the agency to update its guidance on run-up area placement and called for an exploration of policy options for motivating the production and supply of 100 VLL, or very low lead, and encouraging greater use of available unleaded avgas options by the portion of the piston engine fleet that can safely use it. The committee also recommended that work continue on finding a universal unleaded replacement fuel for 100 low lead via the Piston Aviation Fuels Initiative, or PAFI, or an alternative evaluation process, but acknowledged that a universal replacement fuel could prove difficult to develop. Without leaded avgas, tens of thousands of piston engine aircraft, used for a wide variety of beneficial GA purposes, could not be flown safely, the committee said in its report. Decades of research on octane-enhancing additives have failed to find an alternative to lead that performs in an operationally safe manner for all GA aircraft in use today. Hence, eliminating lead from gasoline is a highly desirable public health goal, but one that has been difficult to achieve. The complete report can be downloaded for free from the Transportation Research Board's website, and I'll include a link to it in our show notes, which you can find at aviationnewstalk.com/174. From AOPA.org, airspace restrictions planned for the inauguration. Pilots flying near the Washington, D.C. area on January 20th should be aware of further restrictions to the Washington, D.C. Special Flight Rules Area, or SFRA, and Flight Restricted Zone, or FREEZE, FRZ, for events related to the President's inauguration. The FAA issued a flight advisory for the inauguration detailing the restrictions that will be in effect from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. local time on January 20. VFR and IFR aircraft will not be able to transit the Washington, D.C. SFRA except for IFR aircraft landing at Baltimore Washington International Thurgood Marshall Airport, Washington Dulles International, or Manassas Regional Airport. Special procedures typically in place at Barnes Airport, Flying M Farms, Mountain Road Airport, Robinson Airport, Skyview Airport, Maples Field, and Goose Hunt Farm will be suspended during that time. Ingress and egress at Leesburg Executive Airport and traffic pattern operations at all SFRA airports will be suspended as well. The flight advisory details further restrictions to operation in the freeze. Pilots should also check NOTAMs carefully for possible pop-up temporary flight restrictions and additional changes to the CIFRA or freeze. In addition, the TSA is asking pilots to be alert for any suspicious or disruptive activity and to report those activities. Pilots who are planning to fly into the area during the inauguration can get information regarding air traffic management programs, parking, and more for Washington, D.C. area airports from the National Business Aviation Association. From GeneralAviationNews.com, used aircraft sales spiked at the end of 2020. Following the abrupt plunge in pre-owned aircraft sales in March 2020 due to the pandemic, members of the International Aircraft Dealers Association, or IADA, report they experienced a rising wave of transactions highlighted by a fourth-quarter surge of more than 550 closed deals. IADA officials began tracking sales metrics in April on a monthly basis as a result of the volatile used aircraft sales transaction caused by the impact of the economy from the pandemic. Representing the top 7% of the world's aircraft dealers, IADA is generally responsible for 40% of pre-owned aircraft sales, according to association officials. IADA Executive Director Wayne Starling said, quote, "In total, IADA dealers account for 1,011 transactions in the April-December time period, not counting pre-owned aircraft sales handled by our OEM members. Our dealers registered 285 sales in December alone, by far the most active month of the year, and double any other COVID-19 impacted month." Looking towards 2021, IADA dealers ended the year by putting another 74 aircraft under contract in December. Strikingly, dealers reported that only 36 of the 554 transactions closed in the fourth quarter involved lower prices, marking a return to stabilized prices that contrast with 45 deals that involved aircraft with lowered prices in the second quarter as the industry began recovering from the unprecedented plunge in activity during March. While it's way too early to say the industry has rebounded completely as the pandemic is still raging, the activity in the pre-owned aircraft market is certainly trending upwards across all our dealers, Starling said. Today, the organization lists more than 500 business aircraft for sale on its site, ranging from turboprops to long-range business jets. From GeneralAviationNews.com, test pilot training course debuts. Now this kind of sounds like fun. Piston 2 Jet, a veteran-owned flight school based at Manassas Regional Airport, that's KHEF, recently released a new flight training program, the GA Test Pilot Course. The FAA Part 141 approved flight training program is designed to teach pilots the basics of test pilot academics and how to design and conduct flight tests, according to company officials. Quote, "The course is perfect for any pilot seeking knowledge of aircraft test techniques, pursuing additional qualifications, or interested in flight test or aerospace research sectors of the aviation industry," officials said. The test pilot course instructs pilots in a variety of aviation skills and subjects, including quantitative and qualitative techniques for performance evaluation, as well as longitudinal and lateral directional stability, test pilot responsibilities, the test planning process, and its risk assessment checklist, and the importance of test team interaction. In-depth knowledge of performance calculations of light GA aircraft per the aircraft POH. Piston 2 Jet's safety director, retired USMC Colonel Doug Yurovich, Ph.D., is the man behind the development of the course and also its chief instructor. A graduate of the U.S. Naval Test Pilot School at Naval Air Station Patuxent River, he's also a Top Gun graduate. Cost of the course is $9,950. And also from GeneralAviationNews.com, here's something I've never heard of before. Pilot loses control after being hit in the head by a bird. The pilot reported while making a video of a boat near Santa Maria Island in Florida, he flew the Robinson R-44 helicopter with the doors removed about 20 feet above the water and about 3/4 of a mile offshore. He saw seabirds ahead crossing from his right to left and thought they would be no factor. Shortly after seeing the birds, he initiated a right turn to follow a boat, and while he was looking over his right shoulder, he felt an object strike him in the back of the head. While dazed from the head strike, he flared to reduce speed, and the helicopter settled into the water. He then applied left lateral cyclic to stop the main rotor blade's rotation, and the helicopter rolled left and inverted in the water. The helicopter sustained substantial damage to the fuselage and main rotor blades. The pilot, who sustained serious injuries, reported that he believed he had been hit in the head by a seabird. Probable cause? The pilot's loss of control while maneuvering at a low altitude after being struck in the head by a bird. And from the dailymail.co.uk, Amateur pilot will appear in court accused of landing £2 million private plane at Prince William's former RAF base without permission because he, quote, wanted to go to the beach. As you listen to this, count the number of times in this incident you feel the pilot may have made a mistake, broken a regulation, or broken the law. Any one of these things might get you in trouble, but doing all of these starts to smack of some of the FAA's hazardous attitudes. So from the FAA's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, for example, they talk about anti-authority attitude. They say this attitude is found in people who do not like anyone telling them what to do. Now here's the story. A businessman has been accused of illegally landing a £2 million private plane at Prince William's former RAF base because he wanted to go to the beach during lockdown. The keen amateur pilot from London, according to the Civil Aviation Authority, allegedly flew nearly 300 miles from Surrey to the fighter pilot training base at RAF Valley in Wales. He set off alone from Fair Oaks Airfield in London to Angsley in the Swiss-made 12-seater with the plan of a bank holiday day out at the beach last May. A CAA investigation revealed that the pilot apparently tried to contact air traffic control, but claimed he could not reach anyone. He was arrested by military police after he touched down without receiving permission to land. When told he was breaching anti-COVID lockdown rules against travel, he allegedly told officers it was okay as he had it 2 months ago. He allegedly told officers he thought it would be okay to land at the airfield as he had read on Wikipedia that it handled civilian traffic. RAF Valley's fire crew saw the aircraft and, assuming it was in distress, attended the scene as an emergency. It was quickly determined that the aircraft was not an emergency, and the military provost guard service attended the scene to find out what happened. The pilot told them he had flown in from London to go to the beach. A report on the Ministry of Defense's Air Safety Management System into the incident last year said the Pilatus PC-12 landed on runway 19 at the RAF base. The aircraft was searched by the RAF police, who found nothing suspicious, and the pilot, who was the only person aboard the aircraft, was informed that he did not have the authority to leave the base until it reopened the following day. But he said he was departing regardless, and the RAF chose not to block the aircraft in, allowing it to depart at 2:15 p.m. The pilot is accused of breaching air safety rules when he, quote, flew within an aerodrome traffic zone without having obtained information to enable a safe flight, according to the Daily Post. He's set to appear at the magistrate's court on January 20 in prosecution by the CAA. While the investigation is primarily being investigated by the RAF and CAA, North Wales police are currently considering potential breaches of the COVID legislation in Wales. Security is tight at the base, which is home to the No. 4 Flying Training School, which trains fighter pilots and crews for maritime operations. And finally in the news, we reported last week that there had been only a single GA flight delivering a vaccine, and that flight was flown by the Civil Air Patrol. This week, there was news that a second vaccine flight was flown earlier this month, and it was flown by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Bowden and Major Rod Rakic to deliver vaccine supply through the Indian Health Services to multiple locations in Wisconsin and Michigan. And to tell us about that flight, I talked with Robert Bowden and Rod Rakic, and here is that conversation. Well, Rod and Robert, welcome to the show. Great to have you here.
Glad to be here. Thanks.
Thanks, Max.
Well, Rod, let me start with you. Tell me a little bit about this particular mission in terms of what aircraft you're flying. This is not probably the traditional airplane that people think of when they think of Civil Air Patrol.
Well, Civil Air Patrol has over 500 aircraft, and a lot of those are Cessna 172s and 182s. But we have some special mission aircraft like the Gippsland GA-8, which is what we flew on this mission. Going from Bemidji, Minnesota, to multiple stops in Michigan with 2 health service officers and 100 pounds of vaccine cargo meant that even something like a Cessna 206 would be challenged in terms of making that work with the volume available and the weight and balance necessary. So we actually flipped to the GA-8 because this is an 8-seat aircraft, has the same motor as a Cirrus, but has a large cabin. The cabin is actually designed around being able to carry 55-gallon drums. And it gives us the flexibility of actually being able to remove seats. So when we prepared for the mission, we actually took 4 of the 8 seats out of the aircraft, leaving 2 for the passengers in the rear and leaving a bunch of room there where we could put the vaccine down on the floor and then secure it with cargo netting. And it really gave us a lot more flexibility than sort of a more passenger focused design would. The Gippsland really is a utility aircraft.
So, Robert, tell us how you got involved in this particular flight.
So Michigan Wing put out a call for pilots that were able to volunteer up to a week at a time, and then they had commercial rating and at least a second class medical. And so there was 4 of us that kind of raised our hands, and I was one of the ones lucky enough to be selected to pair up with Rod to do the flight.
And Rod, I'm curious, why was this vaccine being delivered by airplane rather than being driven by truck or commercial FedEx aircraft?
Well, in most cases, the more traditional logistics chain is working just fine for getting vaccine distributed. You're seeing things go by FedEx and UPS and all that. But when the vaccine is shipped, it usually comes in these 1,000-dose thermal shippers when it comes out of the factory. And that allows them to put some dry ice in there, and it's able to keep for a really long time. But this ultra cold chain shipping requirement of the vaccine means that there are some real challenges. Once it comes out of ultra cold storage, a clock starts ticking, and we've got a limited amount of time to deliver those vials of vaccine to where they need to go. The Indian Health Service has this very unique challenge. They've got Native American reservations all around the U.S. and in very rural places, as you can imagine. And the clinics that service these populations are very small. So you couldn't have these large distributions. You had to break that shipment up into smaller distributions and be able to service those clinics. So now you're in between a rock and a hard place where the distances are too far to drive, but typical sort of shipping methods won't work. This is where you've got to apply air power.
And Robert, I was surprised to see that this was a 5-day mission. Describe for me what you did on each of these days.
Sure. So starting off, we were going to both fly to where the Gippsland is located. I'm in Metro Detroit. Rod's coming from the Chicago area, and the airplane's in Indianapolis. So we were going to fly in, but the weather prevented that on Sunday. So we wound up driving in on day 1. Day 2, we spent about 7.5 hours in the GA8 flying up to Minnesota to where we're going to meet our public health officers and pick up the vaccine. We had to make a weather call on day 3 where we were supposed to be executing the mission because there was freezing fog, low ceilings, and obviously safety is number 1. As important as getting this vaccine is there, if we can't accomplish the mission safely, we're not going to do the mission at all. So we delayed for day. Day 4 had beautiful weather, VFR conditions, a very rare commodity in northern Michigan in the wintertime. So we're able to launch, deliver the vaccine to Traverse City, Sault Ste. Marie, and finally wound up in Ann Arbor. And due to our crew duty day limitations, wound up overnighting in Ann Arbor, returning the airplane the next day, and then driving home.
Rod, tell me about your passengers and the load that you were carrying and what was unique about that compared to typical flights.
Well, the passengers were great. They were both pharmacists by training and health service officers with the Indian Health Service, part of the U.S. Department of Health. And they're uniformed, and they're in charge of that cargo, making sure that the cargo is loaded correctly, and they're actually monitoring the temperature of the vaccine as we flew. The sensors on the side of these medical grade coolers that we had loaded on board were reporting what temperature everything was kept at. Now, in order to keep it from degrading, we actually flew with the heat off, which isn't super comfortable in the wintertime, but it kept the cabin colder, which of course allowed them to be able to extend the time that that vaccine stays at that ultra cold temperature. So we did that, just, sort of sacrificing comfort for operational flexibility, I guess. And it was about 100 pounds of cargo. And then at each stop, we would offload a few of these coolers to the various distribution points. And then someone from these reservations would meet us there at the airport and drive them to where they needed to go.
So, Robert, describe to me kind of a typical stop. You'd arrive at the airport. What were you doing? What were the passengers doing? How long did that take? And what happened next?
So we were on a pretty tight clock. While we had good weather, we had some unknowns ahead. We didn't know how long each stop would take. We didn't know exactly if the multiple people coming to receive the coolers would be there right on time. So what I did was once we landed, I went in and got our fuel order placed while Rod stayed with the airplane and the rest of the vaccine to make sure someone didn't just come and walk off with a cooler of vaccine. That was a real concern we had. And then the public health officers met with the local law enforcement that was there. We agreed by law enforcement each of the stops. And the public health officers had all the paperwork that the tribes receiving the vaccine had to sign, gave them some directions on it. And then by the time we got back to the plane, Rod had it all refueled, pre-flight was done, and we were able to take off. So we were on the ground 15, 20 minutes per stop was all it was. And a lot of that was due to pre-coordination with the great FBOs across the state that had the fuel truck ready. They were just white glove service across the board for us.
And Rod, I think that in some ways, perhaps the load was probably the easy part because you had passengers who were taking care of everything they needed to do with the vaccine. What were some of the challenging aspects of flying this mission over 5 days?
Well, the weather was a big challenge. We had very dynamic weather. There was a low that was kind of moving through the upper Midwest. It meant that we had to drive just to get to the aircraft instead of fly. And then on the way to Bemidji, we actually ended up encountering this area of unforecast freezing rain. We're flying along and all the airports below us are low IFR. It's all pink dots on ForeFlight and all the way back, the kind of the Chicago area. So we got to sort of the Wisconsin border and we had to make a big left turn. And we started picking up a trace amount of ice and we knew we couldn't continue into that area. So we actually ended up diverting well over Iowa and going around that. Now, luckily, there was VFR conditions on the other side of that front, and we were able to get there. Plenty of fuel gave us the flexibility to be able to do that. But having icing ahead of you and airports closed below you isn't super comfortable if you don't have a lot of gas. So we were able to sort of make a different fuel stop that we had planned, get more gas, and then continue on to Bemidji. It was just a VFR night landing by the time we got to Bemidji with that delay. So then the flying on the rest of the mission, again, meant that as long as we knew we could complete the sortie in one go, the mission had been planned so that which day it actually happened on wasn't super critical. Whether it happened on Tuesday or on Wednesday, the real critical thing was that once you say go to the customer, they take that vaccine out of ultra cold storage. That's when the clock starts. So they were comfortable with us delaying one day versus potentially, say, making it only as far as Green Bay. So one thing we learned right in midstream was that if these coolers have to stop moving, you can't just say overnight and then go the next morning. It would actually cause them to have an operational pause of 24 hours and recondition these medical grade coolers in freezers again before you could keep going. So it wasn't just your typical sort of go, no go decision. It was this really dynamic situation where we were sort of applying everything we've learned about operational risk management and aeronautical decision making to make sure that we could accomplish the mission within these very interesting constraints that we had that we typically don't have when we just fly from A to B.
And so I'm curious, Rod, just to follow up on that, is it possible that you could have encountered conditions where you had to go back to where you started from so that the vaccine could then be refrozen where you started?
Yes. So if we had to turn around, if we had a problem with the airplane or if weather caused us to have to return to the base, but it would be like, okay, we're going to just land and wait for a few hours and let the weather pass. Let's go when that happens. If we would have returned to base back to Bemidji, they would have gone back into these ultra cold coolers, these medical grade freezers that are way colder than your typical sort of freezer that we have at home. And then they have to recondition these coolers for 24 hours. So that then takes another day out of the mission, right? And that's another day that folks aren't getting these doses. These were booster doses. So this was the second round of vaccine that folks were getting to sort of complete their course of treatment. And the first time they had flown this route, they actually used a Coast Guard helicopter. And so this was obviously a little more comfortable for everyone and a lot less expensive.
And Robert, how many hours was the vaccine allowed to be out of supercooling? What were your time constraints that you had to work with?
So the parameters they gave us was an 8-hour flight duration from when we put the coolers in the airplane to when we touched down at the final airport. We had 8 hours because the coolers were essentially rated for 12 hours. So once we got it to the airport, it still had to be driven to the local clinics for distribution.
And Rod, how do you think this mission, might pave the way for other missions in the future?
What Robert was talking about, when you've got 8 hours to get somewhere, but it's a 30-hour drive, being able to call an on-demand air power like this is really important in terms of the flexibility that the planners can use to get this distribution mission done, right? Operation Warp Speed is important, and it really is the opportunity for us to put the over 500 aircraft and thousands of volunteers that we have with Civil Air Patrol to work, and being able to support our community in this way. I can't think of anything more important.
And so as we start to wrap up here, any final thoughts? Rod, you go ahead first.
I think it's important to note that while the mission was a success, it's really a great example of how a bunch of different agencies were able to mesh together to get the job done. So it wasn't just us flying the airplane, but it was the whole team, the CAP volunteers that supported us, the incident commander, the safety officer, the volunteers helped us with logistics on the ground. Then we had FEMA coordinating the mission in lockstep with 1st Air Force. We had a Replo from FEMA Region 5 on the ground helping with coordination. And then the customer, Indian Health Services, working together really seamlessly to be able to make this kind of complex movement of this vaccine happen.
And Robert, final thoughts?
Well, this was really an honor for me to be able to do this flight. I'm starting up a new squadron for Civil Air Patrol in northern Michigan, and these are our neighbors that got this vaccine. We have a lot of Native American and Indian reservations in that area. And so I literally was able to, in a roundabout way, deliver vaccine to the people I might see at the grocery store the next day. So it was really an honor to be able to help everyone in that community.
Well, Rod and Robert, thank you first so much for your service. I think this is fantastic that the Civil Air Patrol and GA is able to assist with this. And thanks so much for coming on the show to tell us about it.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having us, Max.
Really appreciate it, Max.
And my thanks to Rod and Robert for taking the time to come on the show and talk with us about their trip. If you'd like to see a 4.5-minute video that they shot while flying the trip, you'll find it on our Patreon page at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And Patreon supporters signed up at any dollar amount can see that video. And if you're not already a Patreon supporter already, well, if you'd like to see the video and get some of the many goodies that I offer at various support levels, go ahead and sign up now at any monthly contribution level at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome for the awesome support you provide this show. That's the news for this week. Coming up next, my weekly updates. And then we'll talk about the MIT study that shows behavior pilots have when flying near thunderstorms. And later, I'll talk with Seth Lake about military training routes, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now here's a fun flying destination from John Chargo.
Hey Max, one of my family's favorite flying destinations is Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, identifier Papa Delta Charlie. Prairie du Chien is found on the banks of the Mississippi River on the Iowa-Wisconsin border. The town itself is really nice, but the restaurant across the road from the airport is our usual destination. The Black Angus Supper Club has everything a person would want from a Wisconsin supper club. Think old, reliable recipes prepared simply. They have great steaks, prime rib, seafood, and a salad bar full of everything you'd find in a well-curated church lady cookbook. There's always a couple soups and a block or two of cheese to choose from as well. It is Wisconsin, after all. About 300 yards up the road from the restaurant is a beer and wine store. Wisconsin has some great craft brews that are only available in the state. They're definitely worth stocking up on, but make sure to check your state's local laws before you bring beer home. I don't want to be promoting bootlegging on this podcast. The approach into the airport is a fun one. For a Midwesterner, flying with the elevation changes even as small as the bluffs surrounding the Mississippi River is a treat. On a left pattern to the runway 32, you'll be eye level with a campground on the bluff as you turn downwind to base. It's really neat to see kids waving at you from their campsites on the way in. Pilots beware, though. The only time I've ever experienced spatial disorientation in VMC is actually a night departure out of Prairie du Chien. Lights on the hills can do some weird things to you, so make sure to trust your instruments, especially if it's a dark night. The best time of year to go is definitely in the fall when the leaves are changing colors. The views along the Mississippi are really spectacular. If you're ever in the Midwest looking for a good dinner, Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin's a good place to check out.
John, thanks so much for sharing that. And for everyone else, why don't you take a moment and tell us about your fun flying destination? It's easy to do. Just pull out a smartphone, look for your voice memos app, record about 90 seconds, and then email it to me at aviationnewstalk@gmail.com. Or you can go on our website at aviationnewstalk.com, click on Listener Question at the top, and that'll take you to our SpeakPipe app where you can record up to 90 seconds and it will be emailed to us automatically. Now, just a quick note, this won't apply to most of you, but for those of you who fly between the U.S. and other countries, be aware that effective January 26th, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention will be requiring all passengers arriving in the U.S. from a foreign country, whether you're flying general aviation or commercial airlines, to, quote, get tested no more than 3 days before their flight departs and to provide proof of the negative result or documentation of having recovered from COVID-19. And I'll put a link to that article in the show notes, which appeared in aopa.org. And here's an item from Patreon mega supporter Brian Deere. He sent me this today about strong winds and how pilots are running low or out of fuel. He wrote, the western U.S. had some ridiculous winds lately, and the same headwinds that made my Houston to El Paso flight so brutal caught a lot of pilots by surprise. Even had a King Air pilot land early in El Paso because of fuel and headwind issues. And then he talked about another incident. He said pilots survived after landing on a road, and a Southwest Airlines pilot helped that pilot on the guard frequency. Brian said he heard about this from a controller, and then he sent me a link to a posting on Facebook about it. This comes from The Landline. It was posted on January 14th. And it says, flying into Denver tonight, overheard on guard that a pilot was in trouble, trying to get help from someone hearing him on guard. He was saying the headwinds were too strong and it caused him to be low on fuel. One fuel tank had already run dry. The other had a quarter left, could not figure out what kind of airplane he was in, and that he would likely not make it to his destination of Moab, which is KCNY. The guy flying above kept up with his position. Sounds like he managed to land on a road and was not hurt. As we descended into Denver, we could only hear the pilot who was flying above, who kept up with him to figure out the location to get him help. Before the pilot landed, he said, yeah, this was really stupid, and I can use all the prayers, hoping God would look out for me. Really glad he made it, even if not to the airport. Well, all I can say is please, please, please don't run out of fuel like this pilot did. It might not turn out as well. Constantly monitor your flight progress versus your plan, and divert early if you have any doubt about whether you'll be able to make it to your destination. And of course, always monitor the guard frequency of 121.5 whenever you fly. And I should mention that these days when I fly long flights across the country bringing airplanes from one coast to the other, I have noticed in the last couple of years that the winds aloft data provided by Sirius XM are spectacularly accurate. Much, much, much better than winds aloft forecasts that we've had in past years. And I find that really helps me manage my fuel because not only do I know what the winds aloft are at the particular point where I am, but I can also scroll ahead and see what they're forecasted to be for the rest of my route. So that's one tool I highly recommend, as it will help you monitor your flight and help you make sure that you're still flying according to your plan and let you know early if you need to divert. And I also wanted to let you know that I appeared on a bonus episode that just came out on the Opposing Bases podcast. I talked with co-host RH about departure procedures. Much of that, by the way, was similar to what I talked about last week on this show here in episode 173. But if you want to check out Opposing Bases, go to opposingbases.com or look for it wherever you get your podcasts. And here's a message from Patreon supporter Tom Dooner. He says, thanks, Max. Glad to be a supporter, and we'll probably take you up on some of the higher tier rewards down the road. Amazing work with the show. I love it so far. I'm a student pilot now, about to have my first solo out of Hayward Airport tomorrow. That's here in Northern California. And he says, I have been loving learning from your back catalog. Hope to see you in the blue side sometime soon. Well, Tom, thanks so much for that message, and let us know how that solo worked out. Now, Tom is one of the roughly 4% of listeners who donate to the show, and I'm sure many of you have thought about doing it in the past, and let me just encourage you to think about what do you pay for an hour of flight instruction? And are you getting benefit from this show in the same ways that you benefit from flight instruction? Well, if you are, then I would encourage you to support the show. 2 ways to do that. You can go out to Patreon, where you can sign up with a credit card, which will get billed monthly. And at different dollar levels, you'll get different benefits. For example, at the $8 a month level, you'll get all of my show notes, including cut stories that we didn't include in the show because we didn't have time. This week we had 7 news stories that we cut for time. At the $20 a month level, you'll get many of our shows a day early, as well as access to some videos. And there are other rewards for higher dollar amounts as well. And to get to our Patreon site, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. You'll also find a link to it in our show notes. If you'd like to make a one-time donation, easiest way to do that is to do it via PayPal. And you don't even have to be a PayPal member to do that. You can just use your credit card. Go out to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal and enter whatever donation you would like. And I'd like to thank the 2 new members who signed up this past week. They are both on Patreon. One is Wilkins Vicioso, and the other is Jeffrey Truelove, who added his pledge up to $8 a month. Now stick around, because in a moment we'll be talking about an MIT study related to thunderstorms, and then we'll be talking about military training routes, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let's talk about this study that I came across recently. I thought you might find it interesting. It was done by MIT about 20 years ago, and it was with airline pilots, though I think there's some things that may be relevant for general aviation pilots, especially as you are getting close to your destination airport in poor weather. And what they wrote was, to date, little attention has been given to quantifying the effects of thunderstorms on air traffic control in Enroute airspace. What types of storms cause pilots to deviate from their nominal flight routes? What types of storms do pilots fly through, around, over? When thunderstorms are forecast to affect a particular region, how many planes will need to be rerouted? Which ones? Which aspects of the storm need to be accurately forecast in order to answer those questions? How does the forecast accuracy affect the quality of airspace capacity predictions? In our prior work, and they mentioned a study that was done in 1999 and 2000, we have attempted to quantify the behavior of pilots who encounter thunderstorms in terminal airspace during the final 60 nautical miles of flight. In this study, we compare the storm avoidance behavior of pilots in Enroute airspace with that of pilots who encountered the very same storms at lower altitudes in terminal airspace. So basically, they're going to compare how pilots at higher altitudes, perhaps in cruise, avoid storms versus those who are getting close to their destination and are down low. They say that aircraft surveillance data were collected from the Memphis Airport Surveillance Radar, that's an ASR-9, to record aircraft positions every 5 seconds in the airspace within 60 nautical miles of the MEM airport. To identify aircraft that were in Enroute airspace, the surveillance data were filtered to eliminate planes that spent any time at or below 12,000 feet. The remaining 1,187 flights were considered to be overflights. Weather radar data were also collected using the Memphis ASR-9, the Memphis Terminal Doppler Weather Radar, and the Memphis WSR-88D radar, which is a NEXRAD. And they tell us here that radar reflectivity values are often expressed using the National Weather Service's 6-level VIP scale. One may convert between range-corrected reflectivity in dBz, that would be decibels of reflectivity, and the VIP scale as follows. Level 1 is 18 to 29 dBz. Level 2, 30 to 40 dBz. And by the way, most of what I read is that once you reach 40 dBz, that's considered convective, and that's often when you start to see orange on your radar screens. Level 3, 41 to 45 dBz. Level 4, 46 to 49 dBz. Level 5, 50 to 56 dBz. And level 6, 57 dBz and higher. Most airborne weather radars show level 1 precipitation in green, level 2 in yellow, and level 3 in red or magenta. The study continues. Encounters were identified where the planes appeared to fly through level 2 plus precipitation for 25 or more seconds. There were 369 such apparent penetrations. Penetrations of level 1 precipitation were ignored because they are so common and the weather is generally considered to be harmless. Now, by the way, I wouldn't consider level 1 harmless to small GA aircraft. You should definitely steer around any of the radar returns that you get. Because the storms are three-dimensional, there is some ambiguity in a 2D analysis. If an aircraft appears to penetrate a storm, it is not clear whether it actually flew through the storm, over the storm, or under the storm. If it did fly through the storm, then it is not clear what reflectivity levels it actually encountered. Elimination of the 3D data from the pencil beam radars yielded the following breakdown for the 369 apparent penetrations. Of those, they say 157 flew over the top of all measurable precipitation, so those aircraft were actually above the storms. 143 cases flew through weak radar reflectivities in the 0.5 to 17.5 dBz range, which would be very, very weak. Air traffic managers often refer to the storm's echo tops, which are defined to be the highest altitude with 18 dBz reflectivities. These aircraft were flying at altitudes technically considered to be higher than the measurable precipitation. 64 cases flew through radar returns in the 18 to 30 dBz range, which corresponds to level 1 precipitation. These planes were flying at or below the radar echo top altitudes, but they were not flying in level 2 plus reflectivities. 5 cases flew through the 31 to 41 dBz radar returns. These planes flew through level 2 precipitation. And then they talk about deviations, so these are en route aircraft, and whether or not they changed course. They say that analysts examined animated loops of weather and flight tracks and identified aircraft that obviously changed course when they had storms in front of them. It is quite likely that there were more deviations on these 6 days than were identified by the human analyst. Also, just because a plane changed course at a time when a storm was in its apparent path does not mean the pilot turned because of the weather. The human analyst identified 200 deviations in en route airspace. Most of the storms that caused deviations extended up higher into the atmosphere than the altitude of the plane. There were almost 40 encounters where the echo tops were below the aircraft, but were within 5,000 feet of the aircraft's heights. There were a few storms with echo tops that were more than 10,000 feet below the altitude of the aircraft. And then they go on to talk about pilot behavior for those aircraft that were in the terminal area, so these would be the low-flying aircraft. Again, these 6 days were part of a larger study of aircraft flying in terminal airspace that were arriving at Memphis. The 728 aircraft in the terminal behavior study on those 6 days appeared to penetrate level 2 storms 414 times, and they deviated around storms 444 times. Now, that's a huge number of penetrations compared to the en route. And here's the comparison. They say the difference in the number of storm penetrations in en route and terminal airspace is striking. Pilots almost never penetrated level 2 precipitation in the en route regime, whereas they penetrated it hundreds of times in the terminal area. They say these data do not lead to firm conclusions, but it seems likely that pilots in terminal airspace have several disadvantages when compared to their en route counterparts. Pilots in the terminal area are flying at low altitudes and may be unable to tilt their airborne radars up high enough to assess the intensity of the storm cores. Airborne radars in the terminal airspace are more likely to be subject to ground clutter. Terminal area pilots are busier than pilots at cruise altitudes. Terminal area pilots often turn in order to join the pattern of aircraft lining up to land on the runway. It is difficult to assess the intensity of precipitation when the plane is not pointed in the direction of the storm. En route pilots are able to manipulate the tilt of their airborne radars to assess precipitation intensity as a function of height. They often have some lateral room in which to deviate left or right. En route pilots on jetways in many parts of the country are less likely than terminal pilots to have other streams of traffic nearby at the same altitude. En route pilots may have more room to maneuver vertically than terminal area pilots. Furthermore, the cost of deviating around a storm in en route airspace may often be lower than that of deviating when a pilot is near the airport. Planes that deviate in the final minutes of flight usually forfeit their position in the landing queue and have to go to the end of the line, which may well mean encountering more storms on the next approach. The deviation may cost them a significant amount of time and put them back in the middle of storms that they recently threaded their way through. In extreme cases, pilots may feel that they only have enough fuel to make one approach at the nominal landing airport before diverting to their alternate destination. In those cases, a deviation might mean a diversion, which carries a high cost indeed. Deviating in Enroute airspace may also mean a long delay if the flight path is completely blocked, but it can often be accomplished by a slight turn followed by another slight turn to get back on course after passing the storm. These deviations may be so slight that they do not add appreciable time or distance to the trip. And they have a section here talking about predicting en route pilot behavior. The data in this study gives reason for guarded optimism about the goal of predicting en route pilot behavior. The behavior in the en route regime is much more consistent than that in the terminal airspace. The en route pilots deviated in most cases where the echotops were above their altitude, and they deviated in all but 6 cases when there was 30 plus dBz precipitation in front of them. This corresponds very well to the conventional wisdom that commercial airline pilots avoid flying through thunderstorms. And then their conclusion, they say our previous work in the terminal area indicates that it is impossible to use weather data to predict pilot behavior in the final 10 to 15 miles of flight. And here's a key point. Until at least one pilot deviates, nearly all pilots stay on course even when strong storms move into the approach path. Now, I thought that was really interesting. So it seems like pilots are highly influenced by the decisions of other pilots around them. So you don't want to get into a trap of continuing to fly into bad weather just because other pilots are continuing to fly into bad weather. Getting back to the study, they say, the work also indicates that it's possible to predict the behavior of pilots that are transitioning from the en route airspace to terminal airspace with the intention of landing, because the storm tops extend much higher in the atmosphere than the air traffic that is transitioning into terminal airspace. There is no option of flying over the storms, so the pilots tend to deviate around strong precipitation until they get quite close to the arrival airport. So I think the message you should take away from this study is that, in general, pilots seem to be much more willing to fly through strong radar returns, which of course are indicative of heavy rain and possibly even thunderstorms, when they are getting close to their destination airport than when they are at higher altitudes where they have more flexibility to avoid storms. So just be aware that pilots have a tendency to fly through worse weather as they get close to an airport. And even though you may have completed 99% of your flight and you're so close to your destination, you should still consider diverting instead of flying through weather that you normally wouldn't consider flying through. Coming up next, what you need to know about military training routes, right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let me tell you a little bit about Seth Lake. Seth is an Air Force Reserve C-130 instructor pilot. He is also a full-time flight instructor and DPE, giving check rides in Arkansas. His business, VSL Aviation, operates 2 beach travel airs. He specializes in teaching the multi-engine rating. And previously, Seth talked about how to get a multi-engine rating in episode 121 and about airworthiness on episode 151. And now here's our conversation with Seth Lake. Seth, great to have you back. Welcome back to Aviation News Talk.
Thanks, Max. Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about military training routes. I know you've got a lot of experience with them. Where should people start when they're learning about them?
Yeah, so usually, and just a little bit of background, being a C-130 pilot in the Air Force, active duty, we fly a lot of low-level routes. So we find ourselves on these, it's essentially a type of special use airspace, the military training route. So your first contact with that, hopefully, is in your private pilot training, where you learn about these that are displayed on the sectional chart. And there's 2 types of routes discussed in the AIM, and there's 2 types of routes that are displayed on the FAA sectionals, and those are IR routes, or instrument routes, and VR routes, which are visual routes. And so the basics of these is it's a type of low-level route. It could go as low as, I think, 50 feet AGL, all the way up to 18,000 feet. And it allows military aircraft to go over the 250 knot speed limit that we typically see below 10,000 feet.
And how are these depicted on the chart? How do they show up?
Yeah, so if you look on a sectional chart, you'll see thin gray lines, and they're labeled with IR, VR, and then they'll have either 3 or 4 numbers following the IR or VR. And the way these numbers, the numbering system works is if there's 4 digits behind the IR VR, that means that the entire route exists below 1,500 feet above the ground. If there's just 3 digits, that means at least one leg of the route or more of the route will exist above 1,500 feet above the ground.
And the way I remember that is that the numbers are kind of the inverse of the altitudes. So the really big IR and VR numbers are down low at low altitudes, and the smaller numbers, the 3 digits, are up high at higher altitudes.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
Now, you mentioned a third type of MTR, which I had never heard about before. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so in the C-130 world, we really can't go faster than 250 knots. Below 10,000 is, for one, it gets really rough, and that gets near our limiting speeds. So we typically fly at 210 knots. So we don't need to necessarily fly on these IR or VR routes. And in fact, we're just obeying typical VFR flight rules. So we operate at 210 knots in VFR airspace on slow routes. And these are the third type of military training route. They're labeled on our charts as SR and then 3 numbers. The thing with slow routes, though, and the reason I think that they're not depicted on sectionals is they're not a wavered airspace. So you can't go above 250 knots and you have to maintain VMC. So you're just normal VFR flight rules flying down there in the slow routes. So they're not depicted on the sectional. And there's actually quite a few slow routes in central Arkansas here. It's the largest number of military training routes in Arkansas are slow routes, and they happen to not be depicted on the sectional. So while we're not doing anything special down there in our training, there could be a higher traffic level of military training happening at low altitudes that I think general aviation pilots would want to be aware of.
Well, so that sounds like it's a bit of a challenge then for GA pilots who might not know where the slow routes are located. What are your suggestions for pilots as they're flying around and need to think about avoiding aircraft that you might be flying?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different options, and hopefully ForeFlight or companies like ForeFlight will offer us even more options to display those. But right now, probably the most accessible way you can access that is go on to 1-800-weatherbrief.com. And when you do a graphical weather brief on there, on one of the overlay options on the map is to display military training routes. And it actually has 3 checkboxes that you can select from. You can select IR, VR, and SR. So if you are operating in a specific location regularly, like your home training field, I'd suggest you go into 1-800-weatherbrief.com, create a short flight plan, and on the map display, select SR routes. And that way you can actually see all 3 types of routes that exist in your area.
What kind of closure rates might somebody in a Cessna 172 encounter as they're flying along and suddenly spotting you coming at them?
Yeah, and this is what I like to talk about is the important question to ask is, why do I care about military training routes? It's military training, it's not civilian training. But I think since we're sharing this airspace, and MTRs happen to be one of the largest special use airspaces in the country, in the national airspace, it's really important to know what we're doing down there and what the hazard could be. So just to give you an idea of how big the military training route system is, each of these MTRs are going from somewhere around the surface to at least 1,500 feet above the ground. And they're 5 miles in width either side. So that's a total of 10 miles in diameter, if you will. So 5 miles left and right of center line. Now, some of these routes are several hundred miles long. So if you do the math, it's actually the largest set of special use airspaces is MTR. And it all exists at 1,500 feet AGL, which is a really popular altitude for a lot of civilian flyers, especially if you're out for a weekend stroll, if you will, through the mountains, enjoying the fall colors or something. You're probably going to be right around that 1,500 feet above the ground. So that's reason number one. We want to inform ourselves as GA pilots of what's happening down there. And from a military aspect, what we're doing is training in low-level flying. So low-level flying is one of the things that we use in certain combat operations. In the C-130, we'll use that to get to a drop zone where we're going to throw stuff out the back to resupply Army folks on the ground. That type of flying is challenging, and you don't want to forget how to do it well when it counts in combat operations. So we practice here in a safe environment here at home station before we go overseas or wherever our operations are to do it for real. In the fighter community or pointy nose community, bombers and fighters, they're going to use it to maybe attack certain types of ground targets. But this flying is done again, starting around 200 knots and in the fighter community all the way up to 500 knots. So flying that low, that fast requires a lot of practice. So that's what we're doing is we're down there practicing. Now, if you think about the speed we're flying at, and we'll go on the slow end with the C-130, we're flying at, let's say, 210 to 240 knots, and we're covering about 4 miles a minute at that speed. So if you're out in your 172 doing 110 knots, and we're, let's say, a nose to nose, that's a closure rate of about 350 knots. And that's with the C-130. If you're talking about an F-16 or F-15, you could see closure speeds in excess of 600 knots. So that's only going to give you about 30 seconds from the time you're in visual contact to see the threat, if you will, and avoid it. So things could happen pretty quickly, so it's good for you to know where to expect to see that military traffic.
Does it help to be getting flight following to avoid aircraft that are using MTRs?
It always helps. However, because it is the low-level environment, right now with traditional radar, we're typically below radar coverage in the areas we're flying at. So here in central Arkansas, once we get about 15 miles away from the Little Rock Class C airspace, down at 1,500 feet, there's no radar coverage of us. So really flight following isn't an option when we're down there. So it is a higher risk activity on our parts, and see and avoid is critical.
Well, see and avoid seems kind of ironic because it's hard to even see those little lines drawn for the IR and VR because they're so thin. I didn't realize that they were 10 miles total left and right. I mean, that's pretty amazing considering how skinny that little line is.
Yeah, the line can be deceiving. Now, it's not 10 miles across the board. Some of the routes are smaller. They might just be 1 or 2 miles, but the default setting is about a 5-mile left and right corridor.
You mentioned with the slow routes that they were not wavered from an airspeed standpoint. Hadn't occurred to me that the IRs and the VRs have waivers. Tell us what that means in terms of what they're allowed to do on those routes.
Yeah, sure, Max. So Section 5 of the Aeronautical Information Manual talks about other airspace areas, and there's a 3-5-2 of the AIM talks about the MTR program. So that's where I'm pulling this information if those folks want to pull up their AIM. But you can see in paragraph C there is where it talks about the MTRs are established below 10,000 for operations at speeds in excess of 250 knots. So really what these are built for is, again, not the C-130s. That's why we fly the slow routes, which is just normal airspace. So we're flying at 210 knots. That's fast compared to 172, but pretty slow compared to other aircraft. So in the fighter world and the bomber world, that's their approach speed is 200 knots. So they wouldn't be doing any tactical flying at those speeds. So we make this wavered airspace an area where F-16s, F-15s, the B-1 bomber can get down at very low altitudes and fly at their normal ingress speeds, which are going to be around anywhere between 400 and 500 knots, where they're going to be flying that low level. Now, something interesting to note is the labels of VR and IR. VR is a visual route, so you're flying these low levels in visual conditions. That's what any sane person would think would be the smartest thing to do. But because we are learning how to do this in combat, and certain airframes have terrain following radar, which allow them to fly these low-level routes in instrument conditions. So if a route is labeled IR, we are allowed with certain equipment operating to operate at those routes in a low-level structure in instrument meteorological conditions. Now, there's different requirements that we have to meet in order to do this IFR, but there are aircraft that are fully capable to go down to pretty low altitudes, well below 400 or 500 feet AGL at about 500, 400 to 500 knots, and fly these in instrument conditions.
Wow, another good reason not to be flying around on a foggy day, VFR. Now, let me ask you about ADSB in. A lot of aircraft now use that to monitor traffic in the area. If someone has ADSB in their aircraft, are they going to see most military aircraft on military training routes?
It depends. Currently, in the C-130 community, there's standing guidance that we have to turn our ADSB off for operation security reasons. So in order for us to not basically make public knowledge the types of operations that we're doing, we turn ADSB off when we're doing low-level operations. So you won't see us from our primary ADSB out transmission. you might be able to see us because we are squawking just regular mode C out. So if you're at a high enough altitude and we have line of sight with a Adsb tower, then you're going to be getting our Adsb transmission, but it will be delayed because it has that kind of back and forth. It has to, our from my understanding, our transponder has to hit the tower, and then that has to get sent back to your aircraft. So that's how you would see us. But that we're at a low enough altitude where we don't always have line of sight with those towers, so you may not see us.
Got it. I understand. So if an aircraft is equipped with TAS traffic awareness system, they're probably going to see your Mode C output directly, and an ADSB in equipped aircraft might see it if you're close to a ADSB ground station, which is picking up that Mode C return.
That's correct.
Well, Seth, thanks so much for joining us here today to talk about military training routes. I learned a lot.
Yeah, appreciate it, Max. Thanks as always.
And my thanks to Seth for being a mega supporter and for coming on the show and sharing some of his knowledge about military training routes. If you'd like to read more about Seth and about getting a multi-engine rating at his flight school in Arkansas, which is called VSL Aviation, check out his website at vsl.aero, and I'll have a link to that in the show notes. And just a reminder, please use that share button on whatever app that you're using to hear us now and share this episode with an aviation friend. And afterwards, encourage them to subscribe to the show, because that's one of the main ways that we can grow the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.